Hello, everyone. As the sun has begun its opposition to Mars, I thought that that would make this an interesting opportunity to talk about the way Mars functions in general. Now, Mars is the part of us that is instinctual, that is governed by its desires and wants, and in that sense is very forceful and goal-driven. It sees what it wants and tries to calculate the quickest way of acquiring that object, of making its own, of realizing that aim. And in terms of our personal growth and development as human beings, we don't really develop any sense of our own Mars until we reach the toddler stage. You know, when we're first born, we're totally helpless, we are totally dependent, we're not really in a situation where we can actually have any agency in the world or enact our will in any way except through the medium of our parents. But once we reach the toddler age, in most cases, we have begun to talk, we have begun to move and walk around on our own, and we can grasp objects. So if we want something to be ours, we can physically take it. If we want to chase after something, we can. If we want to say, this is mine, or I want this and I don't want that, we can do that now. And if someone tries to stop us, we can scream, we can cry, we can fight them back. So we have some actual physical means of enacting our agency in the world. But the crucial part of coming to terms with our own Mars is learning to control that Mars. You know, I often think as a dog walker, while I'm walking a young dog, that it's very much like having to deal with one's own Mars, because the dog has its own very set will on what it wants to do, but that instinct and that will that it's operating is faultless, and it often wants or tries to do things that aren't very sensible and which will actually cause it to damage or destroy itself. You know, many times when I'm out walking dogs, they will see a big car coming along, and rather than trying to preserve themselves, they will actually try and chase it or run into it or pull themselves into the road. Now, if they were allowed the opportunity just to totally govern their own Mars, then they would be killed. They would destroy themselves. And it's very much the same when people reach that toddler state. Children are always in that state, wanting things, not particularly knowing why they're wanting things, and just throwing themselves at it impulsively and requiring their parents to act as this Saturn, as this controlling medium that puts up these boundaries, that puts up these barriers and says, and tells them, you might think you want to do that, but you don't, because there are going to be consequences which will totally wipe out whatever it is you thought you were trying to achieve. So we all need those checks in place to stop our Mars going too far. And this is what the card of strength in the tarot deck is meant to represent. It's meant to represent having the power to act, having the ability and the passion and the drive to act, but also having the self-control and the self-restraint to know how and when to act, to be able to moderate that fire rather than just letting it explode everywhere. You know, it's like a talented martial artist is obviously someone who has really refined their martial instinct to a tremendous degree, rather than just saying, I want to fight that person and I want to disarm them or defeat them. They have learned all kinds of very clever strategies involving self-control and self-restraint that enable them to do these things very effectively, rather than just rushing in this blind inferno of rage and willpower. So we all have to go on this developmental journey of taming our Mars, of knowing when to indulge it and when to restrain it. Because if we restrain our Mars, if we restrain our desire nature too much, if we're always trying to crush down our desires and deny ourselves the things that we want, we can end up becoming very depressed. because some of those things that we want are actually beneficial to us, are actually things that are going to make us happy. And by just constantly denying ourselves those things, we can make our spirits wither. We lose our motivation. If we're not feeling like our drive on our agency in the world is going to get us anywhere, we stop trying. And very often, when we have given up, when we no longer feel like there's any point trying to go after the things we want, that Mars then manifests as illnesses. It's all this lust and power and fire that has nowhere to go, and instead it turns in on itself and destroys itself. And so, people who feel that frustration of not being able to exert their will in the world, they develop high blood pressure, they develop headaches and migraines, or, low mood, or just sudden violent outbursts. It can come in all kinds of ways. Whereas if we indulge our Mars too much, if we're always just saying, yes, I will get what I want regardless of the consequences, then we become belligerent, we become pugnacious, we become selfish, we become too blinkered. And that's the problem. When Mars takes over too strongly, we can only see what we want, and we can't see anything else. And we can't see what anyone else wants either. We only see our goal and possible obstacles to that goal. We don't even stop to consider, why do I want this thing? Will this thing actually make me happy? Is it sensible and sane to want this thing? Am I going about getting it in the right way? It's just that impulse takes over, and we just see something and we try and grab it. And people who let their Mars take over too much often find themselves not very popular people, because they're always insulting everyone, because anyone but them is always going to be felt to be inferior, because they have that overinflated superiority complex. So on the one hand, you've got the extreme of Mars that believes in itself too much and doesn't believe in anyone else, and therefore is arrogant and superior. And then you have a Mars that's been too much depressed and feels too inferior and too weak to even bother. Whereas the strength card here, Crowley calls it lust, because he understands that all of our power and strength ultimately comes from channeling and sublimating our libido and our lower primal energies. It represents the golden mean. So the card here depicts this beautiful woman, here I am, riding this multi-headed chimera. Now, the chimera, or a lion in most decks, is meant to represent that primal force, that animal, bestial side of our nature. And it is held on a chain, or it is being restrained in some way. And this is very important. The lion hasn't been killed, it hasn't been vanquished, it has merely been restrained and tamed, so its energies can still be used, but they can be governed in a purposeful way. Because that energy, if untamed, can be monstrous, it can be terrifying, it can be destructive, not just to ourselves, but to other people. Whereas if we learn to restrain it, that energy and that force and that fight and that drive can achieve amazing things. It's just actually having the capacity and the power to properly navigate that, to know when to rein in our anger and drive, when to let it out in bursts, and when to subdue it completely. It's all this constant nuances and responses and reactions to the world that we have to cultivate. But during this opposition with the sun, we might feel that drive intensified, that real need to try and assert ourselves in the world, to make things happen, to go after what we want. We want everything to happen very quickly or not at all. And unfortunately, during the oppositions, that behavior is not supported like it is during the conjunction. Instead, it feels like the more we try, the more obstacles we come up against. We want everything to happen quickly, and instead nothing happens, no matter how hard we keep applying our energies to it. And in oppositions, when we encounter those kinds of frustrations, we end up projecting them onto other people. So I think a lot of a lot of the frustration or anger that we might feel in the world, if we feel we're not achieving the things we want, if we feel we're not being successful, we're not as powerful or as accomplished as we could be, we're more likely to project that onto other people as being other people's fault. That I could do this if you hadn't done this, that I could have achieved this if you hadn't got in my way. You know, other people can very easily be polarized as these enemies who are the very epitome of everything that we're trying to fight against in the world, whereas a lot of the time they're just the ordinary people in our lives who we ordinarily love and whose faults accept. But I think during that Mars opposition, we can have that extreme of wanting that scapegoat to blame, wanting that other person we can fight against, as a way of trying to empower ourselves during a time when nothing else is really making us feel very empowered. And therefore, that strength card is very important during these times, in that while there may be some conflicts and power struggles that are necessary during this period, where if we have these long-standing tensions with someone, there may be the need to try and find a way to mediate them and to express oneself and to give an outlet for that energy. We also have to be careful not to go too far. So I think especially during tense Mars transits, it's very important to have good physical outlets for your energy if you're not being supported in other ways. So making sure you have plenty of physical exercise, maybe you're engaging with some kind of creativity, just making sure that you do little things that are actually within your control that make you feel good and productive and effective in the world without necessarily making it dependent on your relations with other people, because that is mostly where the conflict and the inferno is most likely to come to the surface. Anyway, that's enough for now. Mars is always fascinating to talk about. If you want to know more about your Mars, or for me to talk about any other possible combinations of dealing with Mars, please send me a message, and you will hear from me again very soon.